All right. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
How are things going? Good.
Great.
All right. This session is in English, and it is titled Lessons Learned, Drupal 8 Module Porting. And I certainly am not, I don't think, quite at the genius level as some of the other people that I'm seeing in this room, but I've had enough mistakes that I've made over time to try to give you some tips if you ever try to take this on. This presentation is a whirlwind. There is so much information here. I'm going to introduce the information. I'm going to try to give you some tips and some best practices, but we are not going to get to the level of depth that I would love to share with you. But hopefully it'll give some insight. Here's an outline of what we're going to look at. So brief introduction, where to start, configuration management, look at the entity system, plugin systems, some recent things that are coming up from 8.1 and otherwise, and some best practices. My name is Adam Bergstein, otherwise known as Nerdstein. I am the Associate Director of Engineering at Civic Actions. I have a Master's of Science in Information Systems and Security from Penn State University, and I've really enjoyed exploring Drupal 8 since it came out. It's a great system. So here are some modules that I have ported or been involved with porting. Everywhere from password policy, password strength, taxonomy menu, services, multi-select, secure pages, key encrypt, file encrypt, field encrypt, two-factor authentication, security review. I have 2 Google Summer of Code projects that are going on right now. I just started working on the Composer Deploy module with Jay Hedstrom and a couple other people. And I've been exploring this new sandbox module called Vault, which I think could be kind of interesting. So, why did I get into this? Well, first, porting modules is an incredible way to learn Drupal 8, and you're giving back at the same time, right? So other people are benefiting. And the number one thing I hope you get out of this is that you can make an incredible Drupal 8 module port if you do it the right way. Okay? So there are things that I think are very, very clear to me after going through this now that I really hope it sticks with some people. So where do you start? First and foremost, you need to start with a completely new branch and no code. This is kind of anti to some of the really early Drupal 8 work that was looking at automatic module porting and things along those lines. And why am I recommending that you start completely fresh? Why? Drupal 8 establishes a completely new architecture and totally new paradigms. And if you try to work with old code and you try to bring something over, I guarantee you it is not going to take advantage of it the way that you're expecting it to. So you're losing out on an opportunity to do something really, really cool. All right? So, where do you start? You start by exploring the Drupal 8 architecture. You need to go just read some articles, read more about the features that it offers, the new subsystems, the new APIs. That'll give you some familiarity with how the system itself is set up. Just do some exploring. Just read, right? Very easy. And because I'm going to make the claim that you will not be able to make the right choices of how you develop something if you don't know what the choices are that you're making. Kind of an obvious thing, right? But it's worth stating. You also need to get familiar with your project needs. Be really aware of the issue queues, explore the project you're trying to port, and get super familiar with what it's offering and what it's doing and what people like about it. Trying to kind of diverge or change or rock the boat too much could really throw people off. I've seen issue queues go a little crazy from some things that I've ported that wasn't really great. So try to avoid that if you can. And then generally speaking, find a mentor, because I think there's a lot of people in the world that are really fantastic or know so much about APIs and everything else. They've developed them. These guys, right? So, I think try to identify or carve out somebody that can help steer you in this process, because this is not just trivial learning, right? I think you really should have someone to discuss things with and try to review code and everything like that. And so once you've kind of established a mentor, you've looked at Drupal 8, you have some familiarity, you need to plan out what you're doing. Like if you have a sense of what you're ready to build and what those concepts in Drupal 8 are that you want to take advantage of, write it all down. Plan it out, right? Because you might find or identify some complexity that you were not expecting. And if you actually take the time and jot it down, it's amazing what you might find. And, oh, this doesn't fit, or this thing should be done this way. And this is my favorite. Drupal 8 has so many new features. I mean, views is in core, and then there's a whole new block system and everything. It's really very, very robust, even compared to Drupal 6 or Drupal 7. Do not assume that you need to port something, right? I made this mistake. Like, first 6 months I started exploring and porting. I tried to take a look at the menu block module. I thought that would be a fun one to explore. Well, little did I know that 98% of the features are in core from the new block system. Lesson learned. Web form is pretty much in core. There's a contact form module. Don't port it, right? Or just enhance it, right? Make it better. Add on top of it. All right. So we're going to dive in more tech here. All right. So where are we going after we got started? We did some exploration. We started learning. Let's talk about Symfony and object-oriented. Again, I want to tell you I'm going skin deep. I'm not going too in-depth in any of these topics. For object orientation, Drupal 8 makes use of heavy OO concepts. Okay, so you need to be very familiar with namespaces. I cannot tell you the amount of time I have wasted mistyping a namespace and trying to debug it. Ridiculous amounts of time. Be familiar with the concept of interfaces, right? Because everything in core provides a whole host of different interfaces and tools that you can extend or grow upon, or I mean anything. Just be familiar with the idea, and that'll really help get you comfortable with what you're doing. And the conventions of things like PSR0, PSR4, how a module should be structured to leverage that. These are all really important for OO. Symfony brings in items like the containers concept and dependency injection to help bring and build out the different parts of the system that you might need as you're developing a class or code. These are all really useful for modules, and having some familiarity with how this works can make your life exponentially easier. There's a book that the Symfony people have put out. It's called The Symfony Book. It explains a lot of the core concepts that Drupal 8 have integrated inside of its base system, things like the kernel and other things I'm going to get into shortly. So please read that. It's not a big read, and it's a PDF form. You can put it on your iPad and, you know, give it a read. So 3 concepts that I find that I make a lot of use of when I'm porting things: controller services and putting operations inside of an entity. These are all ways that you can organize code inside of your module for different reasons that you can build out as part of a Drupal 8 module build. So a controller is meant for more rendering driven purposes. Services are built for more global classes that you could bring in through a container or what have you, that you can call functions and run more global operations on, or utilities for that matter. And as you're organizing code, you might think that, well, I have this entity and it has some operations. That the best thing to do is put the operations or the functions inside of the entity itself in lieu of a service or a controller. So you might be a little freaked out, and that's okay. But if you have some familiarity with this stuff, I think it'll be awesome. Another really cool concept that I've found a little bit more advanced is something called a deriver. So Drupal 8 has a bunch of subsystems. We have a menu system, we've got a caching system, we've got a whole bunch of like a taxonomy system, and all of these things sometimes need to work together, right? So for instance, when I ported taxonomy menu, I needed taxonomy terms to show up in a menu. So how do you actually bridge operations between different parts of the system? A deriver is a really nice object-oriented concept to consider how you could link or integrate 2 systems together that otherwise might not really want to work together or play nice. Configuration management. So this was a major draw for Drupal 8, right? A big win. is having an actual configuration system. So how do you make use of that inside of a module or when you're porting? The first thing to keep in mind, and this is kind of obvious, there are no more features. I mean, there is a features module for Drupal 8, but it's doing something drastically different than what it is doing in 7. And by the way, that kind of makes me happy. The second is YAML. If you don't know what YAML is, you need to study it right now. YAML is pretty much exclusively used in many parts of the system in Drupal. From everywhere from your modules to the configuration of the site, the system, etc. And so what is YAML? Well, YAML is basically, in its sort of raw form, just a set of key values. It's a key, colon, and a value. But it also supports nesting, so it can be hierarchical, and it supports arrays and objects. It has its own syntax. So and each part or each type of YAML file has its own expected values and paradigms that it's expecting to be there to fill a need. And we'll get to those in a second.
Would it be safe to say that it's like JSON but uses white space instead of curly braces?
Sure. Yeah, I think it actually looks a lot like JSON in some ways, but...
So I think JSON can actually be parsed as a subset of YAML. So YAML is more expressive than JSON in some ways, or it's just a format, but you can actually use curly braces in YAML in some places, as we see core does.
Exactly. Especially with objects and the properties and So it's, but it is very similar. I think just kind of if you're looking at that for reference, I think that's a great point. So how would you actually use it if you're building a Drupal project? Well, first, you have things like an info file and a services file that are part of the module itself, right? And those are static settings, so those are all YAML. A module can ship with its own set of default configuration or settings that might be installed by default, right? Those settings are, again, YAML. And if your module basically ships with any entities or any definition for structures, all of that basically is stored as YAML when the module gets installed, right? So those are all ways that YAML is applied specifically to projects, but it's really everywhere in Drupal 8. So having some familiarity would be very wise. And one thing to bear in mind, because I think some folks struggle with this, that when a module installs an initial set of configuration, what that does is basically puts a placeholder into the Drupal 8 site. It's like the default, right? But whatever you configure after that is stored in the CMI system, and that's basically overridable, okay? So definitely read up a little bit more on like site-wide CMI usage and deployment workflows. That would be a good thing to be familiar with. So let's take a look at entities. Who here knows what an entity is? I would hope. Okay, cool. All right, that's awesome. So what an entity is basically like it's a set of properties and attributes, right? And entities in object-oriented can have operations assigned to them too. So you can run, get my value on an entity and return some information, right? So entities, though, they have instances. So when you define what your entity is, you have the instances are the representations of the entity inside of the system, right? So if you have a block entity, all of the different blocks that you have are the instances of that entity, right? And each instance can have its own metadata, and we can have definition of what the expected metadata is for an entity inside of Drupal 8. So entities have fields and they have properties, right? So everyone's pretty familiar with a node, right? So a node has a title and it can have some publishing information, right? So those are all, some of them are actual fields because you fill it out, but otherwise the authoring information could be considered a property because it's set when the node is automatically populated for the first time, right? So there's a bunch of, the difference between a field and a property, one's more systematic and the other is more for data entry in my mind. Might be a really terrible way of phrasing it, but that's kind of how I at least approach it from a high level. But in Drupal 8, we've got some really kind of cool things. So I gave you a little bit of background just because I wanted to make sure we were all square on that. The first thing I want to bring up about Drupal 8 is what is called a content entity. So a content entity makes use of all the entity features, fields, properties, operations, etc. But the cool thing about a content entity is that it's basically used mostly for data entry and content on the site. So if you have a taxonomy menu, you would have a content entity that is the taxonomy menu, and every one that you create would be an instance of that. And it would have the properties and everything like that. And when you render the entity, it builds you out a really nice taxonomy menu, right? So that's an instance of a piece of content that you would want on the site based on top of an entity that has its own properties and attributes. One thing that I learned, though, that's really, really important is kind of avoiding the use of custom database schemas. In Drupal 7, I think this was like super, super prevalent, right? That if you had some storage, that your default, your go-to was to put hook schema in your install, drop a bunch of tables and fields and attributes, and then that is how you write or code on top of that. You code your operations and everything like that. All of the entities in Drupal 8 are far more useful and way more automated. So it can build schemas for you, and you specify what you want in YAML. Not a database table, right? And it has a lot of abstractions, and entities have a lot of operations like saving an entity or deleting an entity that you make use of instead of writing queries. So it's a pretty big shift from some of the different patterns I think that were popular in 7. So stick with the entity stuff. Please, for the love of God, do not dive too heavy into database. You will thank me later.
I have a question about this.
Yes, please.
Some people have observed speed issues with that. Like I know when they're talking about web form, there was talk about having web form submissions as entities. When they tried that, though, it simply wasn't fast enough. When you have a web form that has a few thousand submissions to it, the entity system simply cannot keep up. So is that expected to get faster, or are there still going to be high performance applications like that where you have to use your own schema?
Yeah, I don't know. I would love to see sort of, I don't have enough visibility in any potential issues in core about speeding up content entities. I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's a very valid consideration. I think if you do have tons and tons and tons of data, yeah, you might want to consider a database. But I think just the amount of sort of features that you get if you use the entity system, it has a lot of value. So I would think that you should make that decision very deliberately.
I mean, in Drupal 8, it's a lot easier to just, like, your columns on your base table are entity properties, or entity fields, actually. So you don't have to, like, I mean, if you need something that's scalable, like a content entity, but you don't need it to be fields per se, configuration fields, you can just say, I mean, you can make your entity so that it's basically just one table, and it's not loading, it's not doing all these crazy joins and stuff like that. In Drupal 8, that's still fields. Like, that's everything's a field, like the node ID is a field. A lot of stuff that used to be properties in Drupal 7 are actually fields now. So you can still get the goodness of it doing the schema for you.
Probably web form is slow because you have a lot of customized data, so that there are fields added on to the base, which means every one of them is an extra join loaded.
Yeah, I mean, I think that might actually be the performance concern. It's just the application logic on top of it. And I think with some optimization, it probably could be solved pretty easily. But and I think you actually can do that, like even probably using the entity system, to be fair. You just might have to write some logic that could tune a database as you're installing or what have you. Some indexes, I don't know, right? Did you have a question?
Something that DrupalCon Gabor Osni mentioned, that if you're doing your own storage layer, forget about multilingual, because it's all entity related.
Exactly, and that's you really bring up a great point. And when I speak about the features that you get when you're working within the entity system, that's what I'm talking about. It's not just the operations about saving or updating or reading or deleting, right? Or the hooks that you could use or other people could extend. It is about the multilingual. It's about everything that gets baked in, the configuration. We're going to get to this here in just a moment. But yeah, in the spirit of time, I'm going to keep buzzing. I want to make sure I don't am able to get through the rest of this, but I'll definitely be taking a lot more questions later if needed. So configuration entities. So we talked about content entities, right? So what's the difference between a content entity and a configuration entity? The question comes down to export or not to export, right? So if you need to be able to export instances from an entity, you would want to use a configuration instance. If it's purely content, like a node, you don't want to be exporting nodes out, right? That's content. So having configuration, you could export out settings for a type of block that you're building, or you could export out different settings of the entities that you're trying to represent on your site, and that would persist in CMI. So you could deploy it, you could move it, from development to production, very easily, leveraging the CMI layer. Cool. And then the last thing to talk about really with entities is the functions and the operations. And we've actually spent a good bit of time just talking about that right now, that you basically get a lot for free if you stay on the reservation. You get full CRUD operations, you get the multilingual, you get views, right? That you can export or build views with content entities and list out data, things like that, right? If you start kind of getting off the reservation, it's kind of a buyer beware type of scenario, right? You might not be able to integrate with views cleanly, or, and so it kind of gets back to the database recommendation I made. All right, plugin systems. Okay, guys, this is probably my favorite. I love plugin systems. I think I've written like 20 or 30 of them already. So Drupal 8 is not procedural, right? That's like the number one thing that you get when you go from a very procedural system to an object-oriented one, right? That it's the way that it runs, it's not traditionally procedural, right? It's not just calling functions after functions after functions. So things change a lot as you're starting to kind of think about how you're organizing code inside of a module. The first thing to be aware of is that hooks are still in Drupal 8, right? But the hooks are really meant for runtime overrides, like that you're running a set, you want your module to extend something that's already happening, like an operation in the system, and that could be like a form alter, or adding on to an operation, right? Or adding a hook onto a form that you're saving, right? A custom submission callback or something. So these are things that are runtime focused, right? But they're not really focused on what Drupal 7 was using, which is everything is a hook. Extend everything, and that's not the case in 8. So the purpose of a plugin system is really meant to give you the ability to extend behaviors, right? So often, if anybody's familiar with the CTools plugin system in Drupal 7, that system basically was engineered to give modules the ability to create extensible behaviors, and that's the exact same paradigm that this is used. So case in point, I wrote the password policy module, right? And password policies have a set of roles that every password has to follow. But what happens if your site needs a custom role? You have a very secure environment and your organization needs something very specific. Well, that's a behavior that can be extended with a plugin system. If I wrote a plugin for password roles, and any module could write their own different plugins that could extend the behavior of the current module. And that's a plugin system. So does password policy have a plugin system? Yes. One other really cool thing about Drupal 8, because it's using Symfony and has a kernel, and the kernel's aware of a bunch of events that happen throughout the system, kind of equivalent to like hook and knit in Drupal 7, that you could at an extremely low level inspect things about a request or the different contexts that might be happening. And that idea in Symfony is called an event subscriber. So if you really want to get low level, you can explore that as well. I use that for expiring passwords in password policy. I have an event subscriber that checks to see if a user has an expired password, and it forces them to go to their edit page to save an updated password. So what are some things, we're making great time. What are some things here that, that I have found recently that really is kind of changing my classical view of porting a module to Drupal 8? These things really kind of come about in 8.1 most primarily, and sort of have changed things a bit for me. The first one is about Composer and Composer-based workflows and involvement with projects. So let me give you an example. Inside of the encrypt module, it has a plugin system that allows for building out algorithms, right? So if I want to encrypt something, I can say I want the AES algorithm. I want the diffuse algorithm. I want this algorithm, and that's a plugin system. But most of those algorithms are not using something that's built in Drupal. They're using a tool that's built somewhere in GitHub, somewhere using any library that exists out in the ether. So how do you take advantage of that? Each module is able to define a composer.json file that lists out any dependencies. Those dependencies can be Drupal projects, Drupal utilities, anything like that, but also those can be external projects, things like the diffuse library on GitHub. And all of that really happens through Packagist and Composer itself. And it can define all of that, which is really nice. And versions for those too, right? So you can be very, very articulate about the versions that you would support as you're deploying. But one of the really interesting things is with 8.1, it changed the idea of, because, and Peter is definitely probably more equipped to describe this, but the vendor directory that Composer produces was moved out of core, right? And so 8.1 basically sort of changed the capabilities for Composer to be defined on a project-by-project basis. And what that means is that if a module ships with a Composer JSON file, it can update a global Composer file that can overrun or be more contextually aware for the entire Drupal system. And you could see things like Drupal VM is kind of doing some cool things with Composer in its deployment when it's spinning up a sandbox site or what have you. So the whole change of Composer really has brought in this rethink of kind of how things are deployed in Drupal and the different workflows that are possible. And also, I started exploring around a little bit more with some of these projects. You can also see that if you try to, if you're using a Composer-driven workflow, you can shut down other tools of things like Drush that you could automatically download a file or do things. So it really changes a lot of parts of the system that you should be aware of. But this does, one of the really cool things though, is it affords dependencies in and outside of Drupal, as I mentioned. So that's a really cool thing to be aware of because it's kind of broadening the horizons from just the traditional Drupal requirements of a module. One other really critical thing that I would say I'm really not super up to speed on, but I find like that it bites me in the rear pretty much constantly, is the new caching system and BigPipe. I think, and just speaking from past experience, that if you would spend some time and get familiar with it, which obviously I have not done, I think it would be wise and probably could make sure that you're building really performant and super awesome ports as you're exploring Drupal 8. But it's definitely a huge pain in the butt in my experience. But it's definitely worth it. I think the outcomes are really big that you can achieve with the caching system, which is really awesome. Cool. All right, so maybe let's get to some of the things that you guys might be curious to hear about with the lessons that I've learned. I've been sort of mixing them in throughout the talk, but let's get a little more specific here. The first thing is planning before doing. I hope that you recognize the value of getting up to speed with what the different parts of the Drupal 8 system and really trying to thoughtfully figure out how you want to take advantage of it. You can really, really do amazing things, or you could spend a ton of time wasting if you do not plan. I've been there. I think I rewrote password policy 3 times. Just saying. We have a very vibrant community. We've got a lot of people that are super smart. I'm looking at all of you in the room here. And I think I've never found someone in this community who is not willing to help, right? So one of the most important things as you're porting is don't go off in a silo. Make sure that all the work that you're doing is visible. Make use of the issue queues. Make use of the contrib tracking project that tracks what the state of a module is in Drupal 8 and who's porting it and where that port is happening. And make use of the mentoring. I mean, there's tons of really, really brilliant people that have solved all these problems before. I cannot tell you how many times I've had to reach out for help, and there's people in the room that is aware of that. And just the learning that comes from that. I mean, I think it is good to be independent and explore things, but just don't be hesitant if you find like you're banging your head against the wall to reach out to the community. The next piece here is maybe the most critical one that I would recommend. Drupal 8 has a core. That core is built on top of all these Symfony components and everything like that, right? If you're coding something, wouldn't it make sense to look at core and see what it's doing that solves the same problems? Right? I can't tell you how many times I go through and I look in the core modules directory and I look and see what the block system is doing, and I look and see what the book module does and the aggregator and all these other things that you could go and look at, right? It's right there. I mean, it's better than Stack Overflow. It is right in front of you in your code base that you could pull up in a heartbeat. You can use PHP Storm, you could search interfaces, and they're all there. One of the things that I'll tell you what, I find automated testing to be extremely painful. I don't know if anybody else does. It's just a personal thing. But I love going into core and finding how they do automated testing. It is so helpful. I mean, all the unit testing that happens there, everything. It's just incredibly, incredibly useful. So please make use of core. It's constantly evolving. It's doing very similar things that you're probably trying to do. I strongly recommend it. Automated testing. This is how you don't break a module as you're continuing to evolve it. You put out your module. You've built this really awesome, cool thing. You're really proud of it, right? Well, you start getting patches come into your issue queue. Well, how do you know that those patches aren't going to break the crap out of your module? You really don't, right? I mean, are you going to spend 2 hours testing everything and every use case that's possibly ever happening in the world? It's kind of tough. I'd rather spend 2 hours coding a test and be able to run that over and over and over again. So use automated testing. And Drupal 8 has a whole plethora of automated testing right at your fingertips. Unit tests for classes. Tons of simple test related things, browser-based testing, stuff that just super robust, very useful, very diverse.
Did you use your tests for the password module when you rewrote it 3 times? Did you keep the
Yes,
same tests?
actually I did. That's probably the one thing that actually was persistent every time I rewrote that.
Nice.
Yep, and yeah, as long as I kept the paths the same when I was doing some of the forms and everything like that, it seemed to work fine. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, actually, I was going to mention, in terms of, you were mentioning planning out the module.
Yeah.
So I think one thing that's really great with Drupal 8 is that you can split out key logic of the module and write it in a way that's unit testable. So then the unit tests are actually a lot easier to write than system tests and much, much, much faster to run. You can run them all the time and give yourself more confidence that the core logic, business logic of the module is going to work.
Exactly.
And then the rest of your module just becomes a little bit of an integration effort between the core logic and the rest of Drupal.
Yeah, or like the interfaces that you're building for the module. Those are really, I think the unit tests are most important because if you're using and making use of all the object orientation that exists in Drupal, which you should be, then that should be a very prominent part of your automated testing strategy, right?
The super nice thing about testing that Daniel has been saying over and over again that I totally believe is if you write your tests first and they fail, and then you write your code to make them pass, then you're guaranteed that the code that you write is testable. You're not going to have any code that isn't testable because you were testing it before you wrote it.
But also on over-engineer things.
Exactly. That's a great point too. I think the only way you can't do that though is sometimes if you're doing more interface level testing. Like you have to sometimes explore and see what the class names are that get produced from like the forms and things like that. You know, you could do it with paths, but I think like most of the unit testing like you're describing actually would work. Yeah, and Daniel's super, super sharp and an incredible genius of the world. So if he says it, it's probably true.
He'll probably change his mind some more, so we'll look please.
And we could probably spend all day talking about test-driven development, but I think in that spirit, I'm going to move on just briefly. Now, this is a personal preference, and I don't want to get shot for proposing this, and I apologize for anybody who is really heavy Drupal.org lovers. And so I love using GitHub when I'm really thrashing on development in a module. I find that it makes it a lot easier for people to review pull requests. I'm just going to my next slide. You can have people review pull requests and give you immediate feedback. You don't have to produce a patch or do something that could be time consuming and posting it to Drupal.org and doing things like that. There's a nice little tool called Drupal TI, and Drupal TI gives you some event bootstrapping with Travis CI to help you test modules, and that could do unit testing and simple tests, things like that. And Travis CI is really nice because every time you submit a pull request or that you merge a pull request, it has these events that you're able to test, and it fires off all the automated tests to give you immediate feedback, right? Your test pass, your test fail. You know, I know that obviously there's a pretty substantial effort with the test bot in Drupal, Drupal.org, so I'm not trying to knock that at all, but I just find that if I'm really doing tons and tons of development, I like to use this workflow. But one thing that I do is I understand its limitations, right? Because it's not on Drupal.org, and you can't make real heavy use of the issue queue unless if you're constantly synchronizing, which is not ideal. But after I get to a point where I'm pretty confident I have an alpha ready for my module, I move it to Drupal.org. I deprecate the GitHub, and I turn all the testing on in Drupal.org and make use of the issue queues. I find that that's the best way to make sure that you have the visibility and the collaboration with the broader community.
I know that in inline manager form, I guess he had put something he had put the configuration in the project, so we were using Drupal.org, but we would push branches out to GitHub, and then it would trigger the Travis CI stuff. So
Exactly. Yep. I think all of that is actually even more possible now with Composer being the way that it is, and not having direct ties or forced obligations on Drupal.org. You can make the best use of both systems if you so desire. That's a really good point. The last point I'm going to raise here is about some tools. So what are some things that you could use, some tools that you could take advantage of if you're looking to port modules to Drupal 8? The first is PHP Storm, Drupal Console, and Drupal VM. I'll get a little bit more detailed here. So PHP Storm has tons and tons and tons of object-oriented support, right? So since the system is really heavy OO, it's really important for you to make sure that you have a tool that can respect that, right? Some of the classical text editors, at least that I've explored, don't really have good support for this sort of thing. So PHP Storm does. I found it to be really useful. And you could also integrate all of the Drupal code standards in, which is extraordinarily important instead of driving people crazy when you push your code up. If it's formatted really poorly or if there's not enough comments or anything to that effect, that's like a #1 pet peeve of mine, to be honest. If I'm reviewing code and it looks radically different than everybody else's, I feel like that's just really not wise because it's very, very easily avoided with something like this. PHP Storm also has Xdebug integration, so it's really nice and easy if you need to do some hardcore debugging in your module. Very simple and can be integrated in a snap. Drupal Console I've found to be a super, super, super useful tool for generating code. So if you have a controller, you can run a command to generate a controller. If you have a new service, you can generate a command to do a new service. A new entity, a content entity, or a config entity, you can generate that code right from the console. Very nice, very fast, not error prone, right? Because you're not making manual mistakes that you would make if you're just coding it by hand, right? It gives you a really, really quick and dirty way to get something in place and move on and start solving other problems. So I strongly recommend you take a look at that. And Drupal VM, this is not, I'm a strong advocate for Drupal VM, and the reason for it is because it seems to just be highly effective and very polished and very robust.
And very well maintained.
And very well maintained. Jeff Geerling is a hawk. He puts out like new releases at least once a week, okay?
And
it
responds to issues.
constantly, right? And this has a very, very, very vibrant community of people who use it as well. So they also respond to issues very quickly. Drupal VM is really slick though. It has everything you could need to do any sort of Drupal development, and it's highly configurable. You could set the PHP version, the MySQL version, every setting you could ever imagine. It has Drush, Console, Composer built in automatically, things that you could turn on or turn off at will. And it's built on top of Vagrant, so you could really quickly provision things, destroy them, rebuild, anything that you want. It's really nice. I would strongly recommend just in terms of the velocity. If you don't use something else, it would be a really good one to look at. So we're getting towards the end of the talk. All of you now have heard, at least to a certain degree, in a very skin-deep way, some of the hard lessons that I have fought through as I've been porting all of these modules to Drupal 8. But one thing I think is don't make the same mistakes that I have. You should expect more. And pick up where I've left off and go and be even better. So I expect greatness. I think you guys as a community are amazing and capable of doing really big things. So I'd strongly recommend that you explore more of the topics in my presentation, get comfortable with them, and I hope that that was helpful to bring up an overview of things that I've learned as I've been porting. I want to thank all of you very much for your time. I really am enjoying being here. This is actually the first time I've left the country. I live in Pennsylvania. And so I found it to be a really awesome experience, and I'm so happy that I came. Thank you very much.